start by asking you to kind of use your imagination a little bit. I want you to imagine with me, what if there existed a culture, and what if there existed a culture, and in that culture, there was a chain of restaurants. And in this culture with this chain of restaurants, all of the people who brought you food were women. Now, let me say very quickly before I go any further, today is sort of a PG-13 message, all right? And I meant to mention that at the very beginning when I got out here. I couldn't remember what I meant to say, but now I remember. Suddenly came back to me. This is going to be PG-13 talk, which means as parents, you're more than welcome to have your kiddos hang around, but you're not allowed to email us, all right? That's the deal. That's the little pact that you and I are making together right now, okay? So just giving you a heads up, and there's no embarrassment in slipping out. But anyhow, rejoin me in our imagination, shall we? So we have a culture with a restaurant in which all the people who bring you food are women. And what if in this culture, where is this restaurant, and all these who bring food are women, each of those women have a certain shape, a certain body type, and have to have a certain appearance to even get hired at this dining establishment. What if? What if a culture existed where there were television shows and competitions and websites where human beings were put on display and evaluated, judged, sort of even graded, you might say, not on their character or on their accomplishments, but on things like their faces and on their bodies and on their sex appeal? What if there was a culture where people were so convinced that they had to look a certain way that they would endure expensive, excruciating, unnecessary, disfiguring surgery so that they could more resemble the image of their time? What if they would starve themselves or endure brutal exercise programs just so they could achieve that goal of looking a certain way? That perfect image that they grew up being told they needed to look like. What if such a culture existed? And if it did, hypothetically, what would it do to the hearts of the people who existed within that culture? What would it do, for instance, to women, who from the time they're little girls are treated differently because of the features of their face or the shape of their bodies? What would it be like to be a teenage girl walking down the hall at school, or a young woman perhaps walking down the street or going into a restaurant or bar and having a bunch of guys sort of discussing your appearance? How would you rate that? Kind of assigning numerical values to different parts of your anatomy. What would it look like if every time you went through a checkout line or past a magazine rack, every time you turned on a television or watched a movie, you were told, sometimes subtly, sometimes not so subtly, that if you wanted to be valued, if you wanted to be loved, you have to look a certain way and do certain things? What would that do to a woman's heart, to her soul? And if that kind of a society existed, what would it do to the hearts of men? How would it affect how they viewed women, how they treated them, what they expected of them, who themselves were also being evaluated and valued based on their own physical appearance or their own abilities? And one more question: if that kind of a culture existed, then what do you think that might do to the heart of God? This God, who, as we've already learned in this God's Good Design series, this creator who uniquely crafts these brilliant masterpieces called men and women, in their uniqueness, in their distinctiveness, created as beautiful, the only thing in his creation that he declared very good, men and women. But with all that variety and all that uniqueness, that God still sees each one, no matter their waist size, no matter their nose size, no matter their muscle size, no matter their cup size, as valuable and precious to him. What would it do to the heart of this creator God to see all of those he's and she's that he made instead be characterized as its and that? As in, how do you rate that? Or, I'd like a piece of that. I believe this God must see this world we live in, see these uniquely beautiful created things being pressured and forced to fit some prescribed physical mold. See how those who carry his image are being sold as objects and products. And you know what? I wonder if it might break his heart. Because we all know wings are not the only thing on the menu, right? They're selling something else. It's a product. God's precious creation, those made in the image of God, are on the menu and they're being sold to anyone willing to pay. Now, I can't imagine all the things that may be going through some minds in this room right now. Oh, why did we pick this week to come to North Shore, right? Some of you thinking perhaps a bit of that. Oh my goodness, great. Another angry, sexually repressed pastor who's going to go off on sex for a half an hour, right? Oh, good. Some of you thinking, dude, why don't you just lighten up? Come on. The wings are so good, right? That's all I go for, just the wings. Of course, those folks are first cousins of the people who only read it for the articles. Only read it for the articles, right? Or I just watch it for the acting. Marvelous performances there, right? See, this week we're talking about sexual counterfeits. And quite frankly, this is such a huge issue in our culture, there's not going to be a lot of song and dance. We're going right after it. Because this is such a key thing that impacts so many people, including the one wearing this microphone right now. You see, we chose this word counterfeit for a reason. We all know what a counterfeit is, right? A counterfeit is a copy of the real thing. There's usually something a little bit off about it, right? It's not the real authentic thing. It's a version, a reproduction, sometimes sort of a warped version at times. And these counterfeits are everywhere in our culture, not just talking about sex. I'm talking about fake $100 bills and knockoff handbags that you can easily find online, watches, from the guy selling them on the street. I don't know if anyone still does that, but you know what I'm talking about. Fake sports jerseys or falsely labeled electronics or whatever it is. Counterfeits are everywhere in our culture. It is a multi-billion-dollar industry because they've discovered that if the original item is of value, if people want it, then you can be sure there are people who will try to counterfeit it. Anything of value in our world, someone's going to try to counterfeit it and get their piece. The same is true of sex. It's this valuable thing, and there are counterfeits all around us. So here's the challenge for us. Here's what I hope we'll be able to talk a little bit about together this morning. The challenge is, with all these counterfeits, how do we figure out what's the real thing instead of being duped or settling for less? And we've been talking about this in this series, this idea, we've already referenced it, that God is a creator. In fact, he's the creator, we believe. He creates this amazing thing around us called this world, even though he created it in its original form without all the brokenness that makes so many of us so crazy all the time. But the evil one, on the other hand, is not a creator. He doesn't have that capacity. He's not a creator. He is created. And so what he has developed into is a master counterfeiter. And he will take the original beautiful thing that God created, and he will try to twist it, to warp it, to even pervert it in ways that ultimately brings destruction instead of joy, brings emptiness instead of satisfaction, brings shame instead of freedom. And so, as we've already seen, the opening scene of the human experience in the opening chapters of Genesis, we've already spoken about this so frequently, but it's where it all begins. Genesis 1, 27 and 28. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air," and so on and so forth. God makes this man and this woman, and he gives a first command. This is the very first command in all the Bible. Do you know what it is? Have sex. You can Bible it up and say, "Be fruitful and multiply," right? What does that mean? It means have sex, all right? Now, some of you just sort of puckered up, right? Because, oh my goodness, God commanded sex. Sex was God's idea, all right? I don't mean to be smug about this, but he's the one that made the parts, all right? He's the one that cooked it all up to begin with, right? This was his idea. Jonathan talked about this last week. God is spectacularly pro-sex, all right? Now, for some of you who are here today and you're like, "I just don't know if there's anything about God that I can find to worship," you now have found something that you can celebrate about this God, all right? Command number 1, have sex. This was my idea. I like this guy, all right? And I'm going to resist all the junior high, "Ooh, it's so good," and all that kind of stuff. But you know what I'm talking about, right? Skip down. Genesis 2:25. The man and his wife were both naked. They felt no shame. They're totally vulnerable, totally exposed, totally uninhibited, and there is not a shred of shame to be found. Can you imagine what that would be like? To feel no shame whatsoever? But along comes this evil one, and he tries to twist this perfect design. And what is his temptation? His temptation is essentially, God is holding out on you. Take a look at Genesis chapter 3, verse 1. It says the serpent shows up, which is the image used to describe the evil one in this scene. And what does he say? His little question there, did God really say? Did God really say? Because you know he's holding out on you, right? You know those guidelines he's put in place, whether it's which fruit you can eat or what other kinds of things you can or can't do. You know he's just trying to keep something from you. You know there's another way, a better way, but this God doesn't want you to know about it. And friends, it is the same exact temptation again and again and again to this very day. This guy's not creative. He has one trick. God is holding out on you. He's trying to keep you from the good stuff. So go your own way, do your own thing, because that's where the good stuff is. And Adam and Eve begin to wonder, as many of us have too. Well, maybe he's right. Maybe God is holding out on me now that I think about it. So they go their own way. And suddenly, this perfection, this beauty is soiled. It's corrupted. It's twisted. It's broken. And suddenly, shame enters the scene. What do they do after they go their own way? Do you remember what they do? They hide. Why? Because they're overcome with shame. Genesis 3, 8 through 10, it says, they sneak off and they hide. And it says God comes walking to be with them as he apparently normally did. But instead of being there to celebrate with them, they're now off by themselves hiding. They don't want to reveal themselves. Why? God asks. Well, it's because we heard you and I was afraid because I was naked. Other translations say, I was ashamed, so I hid. And so counterfeits enter the world. You know, for every good and perfect impulse that you and I feel, there is a counterfeit available that promises to satisfy that healthy impulse. An unhealthy counterfeit designed to look as though it will satisfy that authentic or genuine, legitimate need. Now, this is true, of course, of sex as well. And churches have had kind of a spotty record when it comes to really talking about sex. Generally, churches have sort of fallen into one of two categories. One, either they are completely silent about it, right? They never talk about it. They sort of ignore it, pretend it's not there. It happens all the time. The roots of this go very, very deep into history, into this very twisted philosophy that crept into the early history of the church. It's a pagan philosophy, a Greek philosophy known as dualism. Not to get too technical here, but basically this dualism, it does not come from the Bible. It comes from the Greeks. It comes from Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, those guys, all right? Socrates, I was just kidding. That was a joke there. I was trying to see if you're still with me. Basically what dualism says is that which is physical is bad. The body is bad. But that which is spiritual or of the mind, that which is sort of ethereal, that is good. That's dualism. That is not biblical. That's Greek, okay? The Old Testament talks about the reality that spiritual and physical are intertwined. They are inseparable. It talks about sexual expression with luscious language. In fact, one of the most sacred of all the Old Testament books is a book called Song of Songs, which Jonathan referenced last week, which describes in graphic, sensuous language this love experience between this husband and wife. You see, to the Jewish mind, the body and soul were deeply connected. In fact, the Hebrew word for sex is the word yada. And yada not only means to have sex, it also means to know. It's the exact same word, which is to suggest that this idea of physical sexual experience is more than purely physical. It's about knowing someone. It's about something far deeper than biological function or an exchanging of fluids. It's a deeper thing than that. It's to know someone. To have sex with someone was to know them at a deep and intimate level. Same thing was true in the New Testament. Paul compares the relationship between Jesus and the church to husband and wife. And he's not simply talking about them moving in together and choosing a china pattern, all right? This is sexual imagery to talk about that connection, body and soul. But in the early days of the church, it began to absorb some of this dualism. And it began to increasingly separate body and soul. They kind of abandoned this biblical way of thinking. And so they began to develop systems. They institutionalized it. And what did they say? They said, the really holy people among us, they're going to promise not to have sex. This sex experience is so dirty, so carnal, that the really holy ones among us are going to swear it off for the rest of their lives. Right? So, of course, you got, even still today in the Catholic Church, celibate priests and nuns, right? They can't be troubled with such dark things because they need to be on a higher plane. You see, that's dualism. That is not biblical at all. That is a completely different philosophy. Some of the early church fathers, in fact, and these are folks whose writings we would respect, that we can draw a great deal from, some of them have been so influenced by this dualism that some of them actually had themselves castrated in an effort to try to eliminate these sensuous bodily desires from their lives, because that was bad, that was carnal. Spirit good, body bad, okay? The two are not connected. And so as a result, some people are just silent about it. We shouldn't be talking in settings like this. But the other way that churches sometimes deal with this is to scream, to get out the picket signs, start wagging fingers at people, right? They focus on all the evil things about sex. They scare people with STDs and sex is a bad thing and we're against this and we're against that. When we talk about sex, the message is don't, no, and you shouldn't, right? So here at North Shore, here's the thing. We refuse to fall into either of those traps. We're not going to do it. One, we're certainly not going to go silent on it because this is too huge a part of our lives. And we're not about to start screaming about it because let's be honest, the world does not need one more church screaming about what it's against, right? We want to be known by what we're for, not what we're against. And that's why we've crafted this series the way we have. Over these last 5 weeks, we've been elevating and celebrating and honoring this beautiful design for sex and marriage. Elevating and celebrating it so we're better able to tell what's authentic and what's not. Because you know how like treasury agents and those guys, you know how they train them to identify false currency? You know. They don't show them all the crazy variations with misspelled United States of America and, you know, pictures of the Pillsbury Doughboy on a $100 bill and stuff. They don't even bother looking at all that stuff. What do? They study the real deal. They handle it. They feel it. They examine that real thing because by knowing the real version, then they're better able to recognize a fake just like that. I think part of the reason so many people are so confused is because the church historically has focused on pointing out all the counterfeit versions instead of adequately and appropriately elevating the real thing, celebrating it, honoring it. I think that's a shame. Because we want to be about addressing these issues. Things like last night. You heard Garrett earlier talking about this incredible experience that was designed to bring attention to the horror of sexual trafficking that's going on in our city. Like within 20 miles of here right now to call attention to these things. Say, we're not just going to sit here and wag fingers. We're going to find ways to do things. And then we're going to take honest looks at ourselves as well. The best way to recognize a counterfeit is to know the real thing. And so we've been lifting this up. And can I say, there's not an ounce of hatred, there's not an ounce of arrogance or anger in any of this. You know, we're simply saying in a world filled with counterfeits, we must humbly, honestly ask, how do we know what's real and what's not? Where do we look for those kinds of answers? And here's what we learned last week. Again, if you've not been with us, this has sort of been one message in multiple parts. And so you're sort of jumping into the middle of the conversation. Rather than rehash all Jonathan said last week, here's the bottom line. We talked about the fact that the Bible raises a picture of God's good design for sex, and it's this. It's to be experienced in a lifelong covenant of marriage between one man and one woman. That is the ideal. That's the lifelong commitment between a husband and a wife. That's the authentic original. That's kind of long, so we just put husband and wife up there for shorthand, all right? So what's counterfeit? How does this answer our question? Well, anything that falls out of that circle, that falls out of that design, outside the circle is counterfeit. There's a quick little interesting thing. Do you know where the word sin actually comes from? Do you know it's not a religious word originally in its history? Do you know originally sin was an archery term? And do you know what sin means, very literally in archery? It means to miss the bullseye. That's all it means. There's another word that describes missing the target altogether, like for the really lousy archers. They had their own word for them, right? But if you sin, that means you hit the target, you just didn't hit the bullseye. And it didn't matter if you hit the very edge of the target and barely got it to stick, or if you just missed that line by this much. If you missed the bullseye, it's a sin. It's a miss. That's what the word means, to miss the bullseye. And friends, when it comes to sex, this is the bullseye. This is the bullseye. And anything that misses the mark, anything, and there are lots of ways to miss the mark, right? Every one of them is counterfeit. It's a twisted expression of the real thing. Anything that misses the bullseye is sin. And part of why I really want to emphasize this point is because my experience, some of my own doing, but often what I see happen, is we as Christians sometimes are guilty of this sort of selective outrage when it comes to this subject. See, sometimes there are certain ways of missing the bullseye that we get all lathered up about, right? We go protest and say all kinds of horrific things. And then when there's other ways we miss the bullseye that maybe we're slightly more comfortable with or even struggle with ourselves, it's not as big a deal, right? Kind of look the other way. It's unacceptable for those of us that are followers of Jesus. We can't, for example, act outrage when we hear of some homosexual experience that someone's a part of, and then sort of look the other way when our friend tells us that they're moving in together, or that they're casually allowing sex to become part of their dating experience. Anything that falls outside the bullseye is sin. And this, in case you hadn't picked up yet, is not exactly the message of our world or our culture, is it? But as followers of Jesus, we think differently about these things. And I know some of you here, you're not followers of Jesus. You're sort of checking all this out. We're trying to be as open and as honest as we can. There's a verse that's kind of a key one for me that often convicts me. It's out of Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9. And here's what it says. It's a simple little thing. It's quoting God. And in this passage it says, God speaking, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord." I have thoughts, and I have ways. We all do, right? Especially when it comes to sex. God's saying, your thoughts are different than mine. And then verse 9, "As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." I have my ways and I have my thoughts, but God has his ways and his thoughts. And you know what I've come to learn in my, 25 years or so of following Jesus? I've come to learn that his ways really are higher. I cannot tell you how many times I have tried to do things my way, by my thoughts, and I've lived to regret it. But I can say unqualified categorically, Every single time I have done things His way, best I understand, I have surrendered my thoughts and yielded my thoughts to His thoughts, my ways to His ways. Never one time have I ever regretted that. Never one time have I wished I'd done it differently. Never once. It's not easy, not always. It does not come naturally, I assure you. Sometimes very hard, but I've never regretted it. And if we're going to experience the full beauty of this amazing gift, if we're going to reconnect our bodies and our souls, we have to call out the counterfeits that are around us. So we're just going to do that. Doesn't this just sound like fun for the next couple of minutes here? So for instance, woohoo! Aren't you glad you came? All right, everybody all right? It's kind of, okay, stretch it out a little bit. Okay, here we go. Thank you again, Jonathan, for this topic. Anyway, one counterfeit that's everywhere you look, let's just call it out, is pornography, right? It's everywhere. Now, there probably wasn't a time all that long ago when you wouldn't even have to stand up in a setting like this and say pornography falls outside of this target, but that has changed. Because in the lives of even many Christians, it's sort of been reframed as just another entertainment option. It's mainstream. Whether it's wildly popular TV shows that people very casually write about and talk about, to best-selling books, to blockbuster movies. And those of us who've got phones on us, mine's back there, can't stand to have it too far away, right? Those of us who have phones, we all know we're probably a couple of taps away from seeing any image of anything you can possibly imagine, and probably for free, right? And no one will ever know. I don't need to rattle off the statistics. You guys know. One of the first skills people learn when they get their new phone is how do you clear your history, right? Sort of got quiet for a minute there, didn't it? See, what used to be limited to just sort of dirty men secretly sneaking into smoky peep shows and strip clubs has turned to such a common issue among people that it's as common almost among men as it is among women, frankly. It grows like crazy in that demographic. Study after study after study shows. Right there in the privacy of their own home, right in the discretion of their own little computer or their own little phone. It's easy and it's free and it entices men and women, young and old. No one is exempt. Now, some rationalize it. Hey, man, this is just part of my deal. This is just kind of how I do things. So my marriage, we've been married for a long time. We got to bring some spice into our marriage. This is our Tabasco, you know. We need a little zip, like Miracle Whip or something like that, which sort of sounds kinky now that I say it. But you know what I'm saying, right? You know what I'm talking about. We need something to kind of, get things going a little bit. So we just watch a little porn together. It kind of gets the juices flowing, and then off we go. Better than the blue pill, right? But here's the deal. When you do that, let's be honest, who are you then having sex with? It's not that person who's there laying in. It's that person you just watched on the screen. You're sort of projecting. And it goes both ways, gentlemen. It's not just one way. Some others will rationalize, I'm single. And come on, Wolfgang. You're going to stand up there and tell me that you don't think it's better that I use pornography than sleep around to satisfy my desires. Because I got desires, man, you know? But here's the deal, friends. If it falls outside the bullseye, it's sin. It misses the mark. It's counterfeit. Now, obviously, the Bible says such sexual expression in so many different places that lustfully looking at this pornographic material falls outside of God's design. Matthew 6:22 and 23, the eye is the lamp of the body, Jesus says. If your eyes are good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. Passage after passage, frankly. But it's interesting. Put all the Bible stuff aside, those of you who are here kind of checking this out but not sure about this book. There's kind of an interesting movement that's sprung up over the last year or so. There's a website now that's called Fight the New Drug. Have you seen that? FightTheNewDrug.org. It is a completely non-religious movement opposing pornography in our culture. There's no Bible verses, there's no religious talk, there's no prominent Christian leaders or anything endorsing it. It is all people like sociologists and celebrities and psychologists and sex therapists and all these different folks. And you go to their page, they have list after list after list of peer-reviewed scientific studies that show how unbelievably destructive this is. It recounts sociological research on how it interferes with sexual performance and experience instead of enhancing it. It has page after page detailing how it interferes with healthy relationships, both romantically and otherwise, how it literally, physiologically reshapes your brain and creates sort of neural pathways that are addictive in nature, and how physiologically it's designed in such a way that it requires greater levels of thrill and intensity to get the same rush, much like a drug. It gives example after example of people in the sex industry who've been abused and enslaved and dehumanized, performing sex acts of all sorts that on camera they look like they're loving, but off camera is killing them. Bottom line, pornography is way more than just some airbrushed, surgically enhanced arousal tool. It's destructive. It's counterfeit. It's giving the impression of intimacy without the actual human connection. It misses the mark. Another counterfeit that's become almost completely normal, even among those who claim to be followers of Jesus. There's a very broad umbrella I'm going to use here, but it's sexual experience outside of marriage. It's pretty broad, okay? But this includes everything from casual hookups to whether it's engaging sexually as part of a dating relationship, which is pretty much standard fare for a lot of people. Not really, but that's the message everyone hears. Whether it's moving in together so you can kind of kick the tires and try out the marriage thing without actually having to make the commitment. Whether it's we're engaged and we're planning to get married, and so, hey, it's right around the corner, why not start now, right? Who wants to wait? Or whether it's a married person who's crossing lines and having an affair with someone other than their spouse. Any heterosexual experience outside the lifelong covenant of marriage between one man and one woman is what we're talking about. It misses the bullseye. Hebrews 13:4 says, marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed be kept pure. And again, even if you don't buy the Bible, there are studies, completely non-religious studies. There was an article last year, in fact, in the New York Times called The Downside of Cohabitation. It was written by a psychologist from the University of Virginia. And she cites all kinds of her research on how this attitude towards sex negatively impacts our relationships and lives. She documents the higher divorce rate among those who live together before marriage. She documents in her surveys a general lower sense of happiness and satisfaction, both sexually and otherwise, among couples who are living together as opposed to those who have gotten married. In fact, there's such a dramatic effect, she kind of coined a new term that she calls the cohabitation effect. There's other amazing research, again, not religious, not Christian, not any of those things. A podcast that I listened to by a non-Christian therapist, it was a TED Talk. Her specialty is working with couples who've experienced infidelity. She pointed out this interesting thing. She said, even the world's standards have changed. Monogamy used to mean having one sex partner for your entire life. Now monogamy means having one sex partner at a time, right? That's the way it is. Again, the statistics are staggering, so much so that there's no point in going through them. My point is, and this is especially for those of you that are followers of Jesus, if you are single and looking, or if you're dating someone, or you're engaged to be married, but you aren't married yet, can I just say, how does it make any sense to ask God to guide and bless a relationship that is engaging in things that you know are outside of His design? Does that make sense? God, I know you said not to do this, but I want you to bless it anyway. Bless it anyway. It's ironic. This kind of hit me this week as I was thinking about this. Remember how before we said the church sort of fell prey to this dualism, this body and soul, body bad, soul good? Well, the church sort of focuses on the soul, kind of elevates that. Ironically, our culture does the opposite, right? They sort of elevate the body. They say, oh, it's just physical. There's no connection. It's just sex, man. It's just biology. Why are you so uptight? It's just sex. There's nothing to it. But friends, the term casual sex is an oxymoron. It impacts us deeply, deeply. As I was preparing for this, I heard a story recounted from a pastor named Andy Stanley. And he was telling about a time he was speaking to a group of teenagers and describing some of this, talking about sort of God's design for sexual expression. And there was this woman that was sort of hanging in the back. She was in her mid-30s, and she came down after all the kids had cleared out. and said, hey, I happened to hear your talk. Here's who I am. I'm kind of in my mid-30s. I'm actually divorced, so I've been married already. But that whole saving sex for marriage thing, that was just for the teenagers, right? That wasn't for adults. Because really, when you reach a certain level of maturity, you don't really mean that for everybody, do you? And Andy said there was one of those moments when just the very perfect thing, right, that right word just came straight to his mind and then out his mouth. And he looked at this woman, no judgment, no accusation. He just said, let me ask you a question. Has sex outside of marriage made your life better or more complicated? And he said it wasn't a second before her eyes started to well up with tears. She got the point. And she had to acknowledge, so often, so much more complicated. Some of you sitting here today, you have that same question. Come on, man, what is this, like 1812? What are you doing? Aren't we past all this? Why are you trying to guilt people and do all that? There's none of that. None of that. Let me just ask you. Has it made your life better or has it made it more complicated? So many of us here could tell stories who know how it complicates things or impacts us deeper because it's more than just biology. Don't buy that lie. You cannot separate body from soul. They are connected, and sex is as much a spiritual act as it is a physical one. That's why God designs this glorious gift to be handled in the boundaries of that beautiful environment, a lifelong commitment relationship between a husband and wife. That doesn't make it magically easy just because you put rings on, but that's where it's to be. We could go on, but most of us, let's be honest, I haven't said anything you didn't already know. The struggle for most of us is really embracing this reality. And what I've come to learn in my life is it hits almost all of us. Now, I love my wife, Lori, and we met in junior high and have known each other for a very long time. And this fall, we'll celebrate 19 years of marriage. And about 17 of those 19 have been awesome, all right? And 2 of them have sucked. But on the balance, it's not bad. It's not bad. And we have our issues, and most of them are her. But it's, no, I'm kidding. I'm just kidding. She's not here this service, so don't tell her I said that, all right? The truth is, it's me. But not my brother, not my sister, it's me, oh Lord, right? That's who it is, it's me. But I'll be honest with you, we kind of have a little confession moment. Keep this here. Oh, you don't have to keep it here, it's just truth. I've stepped outside that circle in my life, sexually. In fact, I don't think it's overstating it to say it this way. My sexual orientation is to go outside that circle. It's how I'm wired. I mean, I have attractions and temptations and desires that fall outside that circle. I will not deny it. And my impulses to step outside that circle might be different from some other people's. But at the end of the day, they're no less real, no less intense. In fact, I'd go so far as to say, I believe every human being is in one way or another oriented to step outside that circle. Because even when we put on wedding rings and we step into the circle, it doesn't mean that we're magically immune from temptation or desire or attraction. I had a friend of mine who used to say, we talk about stuff like this, he said, he's from the South, he'd say, man, I'm married, but I ain't dead. That's what he'd say when we talk about girls, right? I'm married, but I ain't dead. Well, it's true. It's true. And I'll be honest in front of you, I have had to do serious work to align my sexual life with that model. Serious work. It does not come naturally. It does not come easily. Not for me anyway. And here's something to wrap up that I've just learned. This may be valuable for you, it may not be, but here's what I want to wrap up with. 3 little things that I learned, and then we'll be done. A couple more minutes. First thing, you know what I discovered? I discovered that conviction is better than condemnation. It's greater. Conviction is greater than condemnation. This is not a message about condemnation. I have learned that very often the root of these struggles is profound shame. Shame over what I can't stop doing that I try to ease the pain of by doing again. This vicious cycle. Shame that shackles and entraps and captures. It's just like Adam and Eve. We're afraid of being found out. We carry this sense of condemnation. If you really knew my story, you wouldn't like me. So I must hide my story, or I must hide my past. Or maybe there's this sense that we somehow have gone so far, crossed so many lines, that we are beyond saving. Can I just tell you today, no matter where you are or what you've done, that is a lie. Condemnation is about the past. Conviction is about right now. Condemnation paralyzes and intimidates. Conviction has the opportunity to be a springboard, to be a change maker, to be a turning point in our lives. And some here, you are feeling convicted today. If you're feeling condemnation, you haven't been listening. But if you're hearing conviction, then I hope you'll respond to that, because you know what's been going on and you know it's outside of this picture. And you didn't even need me to stand up here and say it. And you know something has to change. You know you need to quit rationalizing and making excuses and explaining it away that everybody else is doing it. Why shouldn't I? Quit hiding, quit ignoring. And I'll tell you, conviction is zero fun. It's no fun from up here, and it's no fun out there. But what I have found in my life is what a beautiful, freeing thing it can be to have loving conviction come into my life. I tell you from personal experience, there is something powerful about bringing those dark secrets into the open. See, hidden sin has power. But when you bring that out into the open, it begins to shrivel like salt on a slug. You know what I'm saying? With apologies to all you PETA people, all right? We don't salt slugs, okay? But you get the point. Like salt on a slug, it shrivels up. It shrivels up. Listen to this beautiful passage from John 8, coming out into the light. Jesus spoke again. He said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Allow the light into those nooks and crannies that you're so ashamed of in your life. See, when you respond to that conviction by reaching out to someone, by bringing the truth into light, you begin to discover you can find the help that you need. Maybe it's the courage to make a phone call and cut off that relationship. Maybe some of you need to go home today and delete that contact out of your phone that you've cleverly disguised as the plumber, right? Come on. Pull it out of your phone. Say, you know what? I'm sorry. I can't keep doing this. I just can't. Maybe it's to sit down with the person you're dating and saying, look, you know I love you, and you know I enjoy the physical piece of our relationship, but I think it's a new day. And this ain't going to be easy, but I think this is something we need to think differently about. Maybe there's some moving that needs to happen. Maybe it's getting help with some struggle with this pornography issue. Maybe it's dogged you for years, and we're actually kicking off a new group starting in a couple of weeks on Thursday nights, just for 5 weeks, because in the fall we have all sorts of available things here for folks that are wrestling with all sorts of sexual brokenness, but it's sort of a bridge experience. We're doing a little 5-week DVD experience that's designed to help folks who are wrestling in that way. And just a little bit, what you can do is you can mark that little tear-off card that's in there. Some of you are going to be really bold. You'll do that right now. And some of you, I'm going to have everybody close their eyes in a little bit, and you can do it then, all right? And you'll be okay. But you can mark that and just put your contact info, or you could just be writing down a prayer request. We'll use that as a cover story, all right? And just mark that. And later in the service, you can drop that off at the doors as you leave. No shame in that. We'll send you an email with some details about that and some specific resources that can help. See, I learned this. Conviction is greater than condemnation. Second, I also learned good news is greater than good advice. Good news is greater than good advice. Here's what I mean. There are a lot of times the churches major on good advice, right? Don't listen to that music. Don't see those movies. Don't go here. Don't go there. You shouldn't be, blah, 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 you know. But Jesus didn't die to give you some pointers in life. Jesus died to set you free. We are not here to talk about how to help you live. We're here to learn how to follow Jesus, okay? Good advice depends on your willpower and your discipline. And I am no good at either. So I need good news. I need good news. Because it's in good news that I find the power to overcome. It's not just about breaking bad habits and behaving yourself. It's about following Jesus. And the good news is, whatever your struggle, whatever your sin, there's grace for you. You have not gone too far. I found that grace and it changed me. It didn't magically take away all my urges or instincts, but it gave me a new focus, a new purpose. So conviction's greater than condemnation. Good news is greater than good advice. And finally, destiny is greater than history. So many people carry so much baggage from their past, especially sexually. Some people carry as their defining label in life something having to do with their sexual experience. Could be anything. And so many people I know who carry so many if-onlys, I wish I hads. Oh, if I'd only heard that talk 10 years ago, Wolfgang, or 20 years ago, or 30 years ago. Oh, how different it would have been. But that whisper in your ear says, but you, too late. Too late. I've crossed too many lines. Friends, my prayer is that that whisper will be drowned out by this simple, beautiful truth. Your past is not your future. Your past is not your future. The good news, it is entirely possible to have an entirely new destiny, forgiven and cleansed from the failures of the past with renewed purity that only Jesus can make possible. Your past is not your future. So here's what we're going to do right now. Whatever things you've done, whatever it is, Jesus already knows about it. And he's not looking at you saying, how could you? How dare you? I can't believe. He already knows. Instead of wagging a finger, he reaches out a hand. He says, let me help you up. Let me help you up. So some folks here need to do a little business with God, I think. And so here's what we're going to do. I want to grab that little tear-off card. Some of you are afraid to even make the noise to tear it off, so on the count of 3, I'm going to make a noise so you can rip it, all right? 1, 2, 3. Ah! All right, tear it off. Everybody got it? Tear it off. This is that time to come out of the dark. Maybe some of you do need to write a prayer request, sincerely. That's awesome. Some of you need to say, man, I'm making that choice. I need that power. I'm making a decision. I need help, for instance, with my sexual struggles. So just bow your head with me right now. Let's go ahead and have that experience. And God, I thank you. I thank you. I thank you because I have learned my past is not my future. Not because I've got incredible self-control or discipline, because frankly, I'm not good at either, but because of your unbelievable, consuming grace. Your invitation to a new kind of life. So God, I thank you for bringing conviction into my heart. I thank you that good news is so much more powerful than good advice. And God, I thank you for the promise that destiny is greater than history.